Hello, Libra. I'm Poetic Heretic, and this is your October 2019 astrology forecast. I'll be going over what I consider to be the most important astrological developments in October for you, for all Libra people, Libra sun, rising, or moon. So let's get right into it. Before we can properly understand the astrology of October, we must go back to the end of September, specifically September 28th at 2:27 p.m., where we had the new moon in your sign of Libra, thus your first house, and it was opposite Chiron. So the new moon is the beginning of the lunar cycle, which lasts 28 days, and because this one happened at the very end of September, September 28th, this current lunar cycle stretches through almost the entirety of October, specifically until October 27th when we have the next new moon. So basically, the energy of this new moon is going to affect almost the entirety of October. Now, for you, it's very interesting. It occurred in your first house of self, and thus, therefore, it has you reinventing yourself. A new moon is all about new beginnings, and it's happening in your first house of self. Well, this is like a whole new you, a whole new side of you, or a whole new expression of your personality is ready to come forth. And especially more and more and more so this month. That energy is going to continue to build this month, as I mentioned. Now, obviously, this will manifest more strongly in some Libra people than others. Like if you have a lot of Libra in your chart, it'll likely manifest a lot more strongly for you. But regardless, the overall tendency is, yes, every Libra person is going to have like a whole new you, especially on or around September 28th, and then sort of building into October as well, as I mentioned. Now, the interesting thing about this new moon, however, and this next part applies to everyone, is that it was opposite Chiron, wounded healer Chiron, and thus, therefore, this new moon and this whole lunar cycle, I would even say, is going to be connected to the healing of wounds, whether in yourself or in another, or even the healing of wounds in another in an attempt to heal the same wounds in yourself. Did you follow all that? Because that's kind of Chiron oversimplified right there. So very interesting new moon that we just had. If you're watching this the day it comes out, September 29th, or maybe you're watching it October 1st, or around there. So very, very interesting indeed, and it stretches into, of course, as I said, the majority of this month. So moving into October itself now, on October 3rd, we had, or I should say we have, I'm still thinking of the new moon. We have Mercury leaving your sign of Libra and entering Scorpio. And that's at 4:14 a.m. Eastern time. And that has it going from your first house to your second house. So basically, the first 2 days of October, Mercury finishes up its transit in your first house. This isn't really any news to you at this point because this is where it has been for weeks now. But Mercury in your first house has you thinking a lot about what is personal to you. It also just has you thinking a lot, period. It kind of has you taking on the energy of Mercury itself in a very personal sense, thus making you much more communicative, much more full of mental activity, thinking a lot more, interested in intellectual things, willing to speak up about things that matter to you, things that are important to you, willing to say things that maybe you were not willing to say before. like willing to really say things that perhaps you've been wanting to say, has you being much more assertive with your communication, basically. But on October 3rd, when we have this shift in the energy and Mercury moves into your second house, now your mind, Mercury, becomes much more focused upon things like your money, your values, and perhaps also your interpersonal one-on-one relationships. These are second house matters. So, indeed, analyzing how money comes into and goes out of your life, perhaps thinking up new ways of making money, thinking a lot about money and your values in general. And that is October 3rd through the rest of the month. So let us see here. On October 4th at 12:21 a.m. Eastern Time, so the very early, not even the early hours, but the early minutes of October 4th, we have Mars leaving Virgo and entering Libra, and thus going from your 12th to your first house. So again, this is not really news to you because this is where Mars has been for quite a few weeks now for you, but it's finishing up its transit in your 12th house in the first 3 days of October. And so just to be thorough, I'll go over that real quick. Mars in your 12th is energy and priorities directed inward and directed into solitude and private matters. The 12th house is all about sort of like isolation and solitude. And Mars is energy, it's physical energy, it's motivation, it's what we fight for, it's what's important to us, what we prioritize. So you get the idea there. Now, with the 12th house also being associated with dreams, it can make your dreaming life more active. It can stimulate your imagination. It can also be a time where you reflect on your goals, with Mars being a very assertive and go-getter kind of planet, but the 12th house being kind of almost the opposite of that in a way, being much more, again, about aloneness and whatnot. But anyway, you get the idea. And that's just for the first 3 days of October. Mars finishes up that transit through your 12th house. Now, when Mars enters your your first house on October 4th, however, there is indeed this significant shift in energy. And actually, what I forgot to mention with Mars in the 12th, but this connects into what I'm about to say about Mars in your first, is that on the downside, Mars in your 12th house is not exactly the best time for your physical health, but it's a good time to make sure you get your rest, I should say. But once Mars then moves into your first house, it's just the opposite. And now your physical health and your physical vitality are heightened, or at the very least, there's a strong tendency for your physical energy levels to be heightened. And indeed, the first house being right where Mars feels at home with its very personal, assertive energy. Of course, many will say the first house corresponds to the sign of Aries, which is ruled by Mars. This has you indeed feeling much more assertive and ready to stand your ground and not give in, ready to act, ready to do, ready to fight, ready to make your mark on the world. So prepare to feel very energized and very assertive and powerful in the month of October, specifically, again, beginning October 4th and then through the rest of the month. All right, so on October 8th, Venus leaves your sign of Libra and enters Scorpio at 1:05 p.m. Eastern Time, thus going from your first to your second house. So the first 7.5 days of October, Venus finishes up its transit in your first house, which Venus in the first has you feeling much more, a number of things: romantic, pleasure seeking, um, caring more about your personal appearance. It's like you sort of, similar with Mercury in the first, taking on the energy of Mercury in a very personal sense. Venus in your first is pretty much the same thing, but applying to Venus, taking on the energy of Venus in a very personal sense. And so, Venus, the planet of love, the planet of beauty, the planet of socialization and social harmony, all of these things become important to you as Venus transits your first house. And you'll likely find, or you probably have in recent weeks, that people find you even more likable than usual. So it's very nice. Now, when Venus moves into your second house on October 8th, as I mentioned, now that Venusian focus is much more surrounding your money, your values, and perhaps, again, interpersonal one-on-one relationships. But to be more specific, Venus in the second house is like wanting to enjoy the pleasures of life, the physical, sensual pleasures of life. Venus is all about that kind of stuff naturally. And the second house being associated with like money and possessions, uh, Venus is right at home in that sense and is ready to indulge in the physical pleasures and possessions of life. Now, you might want to be careful not to spend too much money. However, Venus in your second house might make you want to spend a lot because, again, the desire for indulgence and like physical pleasures. So be careful about that. The second house being associated with money. Let's see. The only other thing I would say is kind of an interesting little procession that I've noticed here about Venus from the first to the second. When Venus is in your first house, as it is in the first 7.5 days of October, as I mentioned a little bit ago, that's like a time where romance becomes much more important to you. It will become much more important to most Libras, not exactly everyone, because everyone's unique, and this is a general reading, and astrology is far more complicated, like if we were dealing with a personal chart. But Libran people in general, romance will become more important when Venus is in their first house. And then when it goes into your second house, it's almost like, well, hopefully you found someone, if romance is indeed important to you in that way, because once Venus is in your second house, it's like you would rather enjoy the comfort of someone familiar rather than find someone new at that point. So again, that transition is October 8th. So from October 8th onward, well, specifically October 8th at 1:05 p.m. Eastern Time onward for October, Venus is in your second house. So if romance is important to you, hopefully you found someone by October 8th. But don't let that discourage you if you still feel like searching for someone after October 8th. Like I said, this is a general reading. There will be some exceptions. On October 11th, Mercury enters its retrograde shadow in Scorpio, and that is your second house. So let me explain this whole deal briefly. When I say Mercury enters its retrograde shadow, to understand that Mercury retrograde is like a pendulum. So imagine my finger is Mercury, and it's just traveling along the sky. It's like do, and then it goes to make a pendulum swing. Okay. Now at this point, as it's about to swing back this way, this is the Mercury retrograde, and then it moves forward again. Now, when it makes the first swing forward, that is it entering its shadow. When it goes retrograde, that is it going retrograde, the second swing, the swing backwards. And then when it goes direct, that is considered entering its shadow again, and then it moves on. So On October 11th, that is when that first pendulum swing begins, when it enters its shadow. So what does this mean for you? Basically, it means that, well, that means this for every sign this month, that on October 11th, it's going to start to begin to feel like Mercury is retrograde already. We're going to get some previews or some sort of early inklings of that, perhaps you could say. So be ready for that. Now, I'll try to explain this briefly as well, because, I could go into a whole discourse about this, I suppose, but basically, there are different opinions on Mercury retrograde. Some think it's like the end of the world. Other people think that it's not really much to worry about as long as you're careful. I tend to take a middle of the road approach by saying that while I don't think it's the end of the world, I do think it should be honored if or whenever possible, meaning I do think that you should at least try to avoid starting new things during a Mercury retrograde. You should be careful about your communication and working with technological devices and the possibility of things going wrong when it comes to short trips, or well, even long trips, really, with Mercury's association with movement. Communication mishaps, they do tend to happen during Mercury retrograde. Some seem to be worse than others, but that's my take on it. You're free to do what you want, but my advice is, don't freak out about it. Mercury is retrograde like all the freaking time, as far as I'm concerned, or like, so much of the time. Not obviously not literally all the time, but so I don't really worry about it too much, but at the same time, I try to honor it as best I can, because I find in my own personal experience that when we honor the energy of the universe, things just tend to go a lot better. But that's just my experience. So that's my take on that. Again, October 11th is when Mercury enters its retrograde shadow. Doesn't actually go retrograde until the very end of the month. And by the way, that is in your second house, again, of money, values, and interpersonal one-on-one relationships. So you can think of a planet going retrograde as the signal of that planet being amplified. When Mercury is when Mercury is going retrograde, I meant to say in your second house, you can think of all of that mental focus on your money, your values, and your one-on-one relationships to be turned up, to be amplified. On October 13th, we have the full moon in Aries at 5:07 p.m. That is in your seventh house. So, first of all, before we talk about the full moon being in your seventh house, let us remember, as I said earlier, about the new moon in your first house. Now, the energy has been building up until this point, the lunar cycle energy. And it's on the full moon that the energy comes to a peak. It comes to a climax. This is where things happen. This is where things come to a head. So on October 13th, expect things to happen. Expect that new moon in your first house of self, where you are reinventing yourself in some way. It's a whole new you. Expect that to really make a powerful impact in some significant way on October 13th. So you can look forward to that. Indeed, maybe that's where you'll really sort of show yourself in a powerful way, or show the new you to the world. So lots of fun there. Now, what's interesting, of course, also is that the full moon itself is taking place in your seventh house of partnerships and relationships. And so you can also expect those things, or that area of life, to be activated by this full moon. So in whatever way that may manifest for you, it might be a turning point in an already existing relationship. It might be finding a new relationship or even just making a new partnership. Doesn't necessarily have to be like a romantic relationship. Basically, relationships and partnerships, things will come to a head in that area as well on October 13th. So you're probably noticing a theme by now in this month, which is that we're having a lot of things going from your first to your second house. Well, the next thing when the sun changes signs is just backing that up further, but let's go over it. The sun enters Scorpio on October 23rd at 1:19 p.m., as it does every year this time of year, going from your first to your second house. So the sun is the giver of life. It is our life force. It is our conscious awareness. It is our sense of self. It gives life to what it touches. It vivifies what it touches. So as it's been transiting your first house through October, through the final about 1/3 of September through October 23rd, if we want to be specific about it. Again, your first house of self has been lit up. You personally, the focus, your consciousness, your awareness has been on yourself personally, and that's even more so, of course, at least up until October 3rd, technically, when Mercury was transiting your first house. But it's like, in addition to that, the sun has been sort of vivifying you, enlivening you through October 23rd. So that's very good. The sun just energizing you in a very personal way. A very nice, delightful placement for the sun. But it does then enter your second house on October 23rd. And so now your awareness and your focus and what is being energized by the sun and given life by the sun is yet again your second house of your money, your values, and your one-on-one relationships. So there you go. And that'll, of course, be for the rest of October and into November. And by the way, while it is, just as an aside, while it is normal for Mercury and Venus to travel fairly close to the sun from Earth's perspective, it is, first of all, it's not exactly normal for them to be this close to the sun. So having all this stuff going from your first to your second house. And it's also less common for Mars to be in the mix. And Mars is in the mix, has been in the mix. That was especially so more like in August and September. Now Mars is separating from the pack somewhat because Mars moves slower, again, from Earth's perspective, than Mercury and Venus, and the sun as well. And so that is why Mars is actually falling back a little bit and going from your 12th house to your first house this month rather than from your first to your second. But just a little aside, I feel like I should say that to every sign this month, honestly, because it's like, why is everything, one house to another almost? It's because a lot of planets have been together recently. Wow, look at the sun shining through the window like that. That's interesting. See, right as I talk about the sun starts shining on me. Isn't that funny? And I'll have you know, by the way, dear Libras, I am a Libra rising. So it applies to me too, that the sun is entering my, I guess you could call this my first house right now, perhaps. It's right on me personally. So there you go. I mean, it's also entering my physical house because it's shining on me, but all right, let's just continue. So on October 27th, we have the new moon in Scorpio. So the next lunar cycle begins at 11:38 p.m. Eastern time. And that is in your second house, and it is opposite Uranus. So this is a very interesting new moon. First of all, with it being in your second house, it is, of course, going to mean new beginnings surrounding those second house matters of, yet again, money, your values, and your interpersonal one-on-one relationships. So new beginnings in any or all of those areas beginning October 27th and building and building and building into and throughout much of November. So that's very interesting on its own. But in addition to that, as I said, this new moon is opposite Uranus. Sudden, shocking, unexpected Uranus. The planet of great revelations, sudden insights. The weird planet. The unique planet. The planet of WTF, of what just happened. The planet of the lightning strike. And so it's interesting. This is my personal astrological theory on this, of what I think this new moon is going to manifest as for everyone of every sign, or at least for many people. So the new moon is already a time where new things happen. A new cycle begins. Uranus being about, you could say in many cases, sudden, shocking new beginnings, leads me to conclude that this new moon is going to come in like a bolt of lightning, and there's going to be a sudden new beginning in many people's lives. Now, how that manifests in every individual's life is going to depend on such people's charts, and I would also argue that it's going to depend at least somewhat on their free will, though I know some people think free will is an illusion, and maybe it is. I guess I can't prove that it isn't. But regardless, even if free will is an illusion, then it's still going to depend on each individual's chart. But generally speaking, yes, I think this new moon is likely to be one where we have probably some kind of sort of crazy, sudden, shocking developments, or some sudden new beginning or some sudden like event, I would say, not necessarily the new beginning itself, but some sudden event that then triggers or facilitates this new beginning. So there you go. Again, that's October 27th, 11:38 p.m. Eastern time. I guess in some parts of the world, it'll be October 28th because of the how late at night it is, how close to midnight it is. Or I should say many parts of the world. All right. On October 30th, we have a Mercury-Venus conjunction in Scorpio at 6:04 p.m. And that is in your second house yet again. So when Mercury and Venus get together, the planet of the mind and the planet of love, it's like, let's talk things out, let's reconcile, let's work together on things, let's find a solution, let's be diplomatic, let's find harmony through communication. You know, if we had a problem in the past, let's work together now and find harmony through talking things out, through understanding it, that sort of thing. So that's Mercury-Venus conjunction. That applies to everyone, October 30th. For you specifically, Libra, with it taking place in your second house, there's going to be an emphasis yet again of your money, your values, your one-on-one relationships. And so I would imagine for a lot of you, it could quite possibly be, oh, let's find resolutions surrounding money or material possessions, quite possibly. And that's especially because Venus is in the mix. And again, Venus is all about indulgence and sensual and material pleasures. And Venus is indeed about money and that sort of thing. So that is what I would say is quite possible to happen. It might even be a time, I might be going out a bit on a limb here, so don't take this as extremely likely, but it might even be a time where there's some kind of breakthrough involving material things, something that perhaps you've been wanting, because I actually just saw prior to filming this, a Mercury-Venus conjunction seemingly manifest as that way for me personally, where just suddenly, just like that, I got something that I'd been wanting. So there may be a bit of a breakthrough for some of you as well. I could see that maybe happening since Mercury is actually connected to Uranus, as I was mentioning earlier, and Uranus is also a planet of breakthroughs. So again, that's kind of a stretch, kind of like far out there somewhat, but I'm just mentioning it because it did seem to manifest that way for me just recently, like today. So, all right. The final thing I have for you here is on October 31st, Mercury does indeed station retrograde in Scorpio, your second house, at 11:41 a.m. So Halloween day, happy Halloween, is when Mercury goes retrograde. So again, this is just more of what I mentioned earlier, only now Mercury has reached the end of the first pendulum swing and slowly begins to make the second swing backwards. So essentially take everything I said earlier about the Mercury retrograde and expect it to intensify on October 31st. Halloween should make for quite the interesting Halloween. And of course, that will last for weeks to come, for most of November, in fact, but we'll talk more about that next month. So that's about it, Libra. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a magnificent October and a very happy, hopefully non-Mercury retrograde plagued Halloween. And I do hope to see you next time. Speaking of which, feel free to subscribe if you're not already, because I do indeed plan on returning very soon with more astrology and tarot related videos, content, astrology and tarot forecasts. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.